Night my son told me not to come for Christmas. I was standing in my kitchen holding a casserole dish I just pulled from the oven. I'd made it because I was bringing it to his house. That was the plan. Drive 4 hours to Denver, spend 3 days with him and his wife and their 2 kids, wake up Christmas morning on their pull-out couch, and watch my grandchildren tear into their presents. That was what I'd been looking forward to since October. My phone buzzed on the counter. I looked down and saw his name. I answered, still holding the dish with one hand. He didn't say hello. He said, "Dad, listen, I need to tell you something and I need you to not make it into a big thing." I set the dish down. "Okay," I said, "Christmas isn't going to work this year. My wife's family is coming in from Portland and the house is there's not enough room. It's not a good time." I stood there for a second. "I can get a hotel." "Dad, I'm not asking to sleep on the floor. I just want to see the kids on Christmas morning. I'll get a room at the..." "It's not about the room." His voice had that flatness to it. The one I've been hearing more and more over the last few years. Like he was explaining something to someone who kept missing the point. "My wife is stressed. Her mother is difficult. Having extra people around doesn't help. I need you to understand that." Extra people. That's what he said. Extra people. I was 63 years old. I had driven to every one of his kids' birthday parties for 6 years. I had shown up with presents and balloons and put the bikes together myself on the driveway at 10 o'clock at night. I had sat in the waiting room when his daughter had her tonsils out and brought him coffee because he'd forgotten to eat. "Extra people. I understand," I said, because I didn't know what else to say. "Thanks, Dad. I knew you'd get it." We hung up. I stood in the kitchen for a while. The casserole was still warm. I covered it with foil and put it in the refrigerator, and then I sat down at my kitchen table in Omaha, Nebraska, and I looked at the wall. My wife had died 4 years earlier. Pancreatic cancer, 14 months from diagnosis to the end. After she was gone, my son was the only immediate family I had left. His sister, my daughter, lived in Austin, and we talked on the phone, but she had her own life, her own friends, her own husband, and his family. She was kind to me, but Christmas was her in-laws' holiday, had been for years. I hadn't complained about any of it. I told myself this was how it went. Children grow up. They build their own lives. You don't get to be the center anymore. But sitting at that table on December 21st, I understood for the first time that there's a difference between not being the center and being told you don't belong at the table at all. I thought about calling someone. There was nobody to call. The next morning, I drove to a diner near my house for breakfast, because the thought of eating cereal in my kitchen on Christmas Eve was something I couldn't face. The place was called Patsy's. I'd eaten there 100 times over the years, usually after church, usually with my wife. The boats were red vinyl and the coffee came in mugs that were too big and the eggs were never quite right. But I kept going back because it felt like the kind of place that had been there forever and would keep being there. I sat at the counter because I didn't want to take up a booth alone. The woman who sat down 2 stools over didn't ask if she could. She just did. She was somewhere in her late 60s, grey hair cut short, wearing a green sweater with a small pin on it that said, "World's Okayest Grandma." She had a paperback face down on the counter next to her coffee. She looked over at me and said, "You look like you're trying to decide whether the eggs are worth it." I laughed. I hadn't expected to. "They're not," I said. "But I keep ordering them anyway." "That's basically my entire life philosophy," she said. Her name was Loretta. She was there because her husband was picking up her sister from the airport and she'd gotten tired of waiting at home. She had 3 grandchildren in town for the week and a daughter who she said was a handful in the best possible way. I don't know why I told her. Maybe because she was a stranger. And strangers don't look at you the way people who know you do. She didn't have context for me. She didn't know what I was supposed to be. I told her my son had asked me not to come. She didn't say she was sorry. She didn't tell me it would be okay. She just nodded slowly and said, "What are you going to do instead?" "I don't know yet." "Well," she looked at her coffee. "You could come to dinner with us. I'm serious. We've got too much food and my husband doesn't care and my daughter would love it. She collects people." I said no, of course, 3 or 4 times. She kept not accepting it in a way that wasn't pushy, just persistent, like she'd simply decided I was coming and was waiting for me to figure that out. I showed up at her house at 4 o'clock on Christmas Day with a bottle of wine and the casserole I'd been keeping in my refrigerator for 4 days. Her husband was named Gene. He was a big man with a white beard and hearing aids in both ears, and he shook my hand and said, Robert, good, we needed another man in here. It's been 3-1 all morning. Their daughter was named Carrie, 41, recently divorced, with a laugh that arrived about 2 seconds before everything she found funny. Her kids were 8 and 12, and 10 minutes after I sat down, the 12-year-old was showing me something on his phone that he'd built in Minecraft. After dinner, we played cards at the kitchen table. I stayed until 9. When I left, Loretta hugged me at the door and Jean shook my hand again, and Gary said, "You're coming back for New Year's. I'm not asking." I drove home in the dark and I didn't feel sorry for myself. That surprised me. Over the following months, I went back. Not for every Sunday, not with any formal arrangement, just back. Jean had a workshop in his garage where he built things out of wood, mostly boxes and small furniture, and he'd asked if I wanted to see it, and then we'd spent 3 hours in there and I'd forgotten what time it was. Loretta and I walked the neighborhood sometimes on Saturday mornings when the weather allowed. Carrie texted me links to articles she thought I'd find interesting, which I did, and I texted back. I was not their family, I knew that, but I was something. In the spring, my son called. I knew before I answered what the call was about, or at least what category of call it was. I'd gotten enough of them over the past few years to recognize the shape of them. There was a pause before he spoke that was a little too long. There was a carefulness in how he said my name. "Hey Dad, how are you?" Not a question, a preamble. "I'm fine," I said. "What's going on?" What was going on was that he and his wife were looking at refinancing their mortgage, and they were short on the down payment difference, and they were wondering if I might be able to help bridge it. He said, "Bridget." He said it in the tone of someone who had thought about how to phrase this and had landed on bridge as the word that made it sound most temporary and reasonable. The number he mentioned was $18,000. I had it. That wasn't the issue. I had my retirement, my pension from 31 years as an electrical engineer, my wife's life insurance, the equity in my house. I was not a wealthy man, but I was not struggling. "Let me think about it," I said. "Of course, yeah, take your time." I talked to Gene about it. Not to ask his opinion, just to think out loud, and Gene was the kind of man who knew the difference. He sat on his stool in the workshop and let me talk. When I was done, he said, "You already know what you're going to do." Do I? You wouldn't be talking about it if you'd already decided yes. I called a financial advisor I'd been using for 8 years, a woman named Janet who had no patience for financial decisions made out of guilt. She listened to what I described and said, "Robert, this is your retirement. This is what you live on for the next 30 years. This is not a piggy bank." I called my son back 3 days later. I told him I couldn't do it. I said I was sorry, that I wished I were in a position to help, that I hoped they found another way through. I kept my voice steady. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I thought you had savings." "I do," I said, "and I need them." Another pause. "Okay, Dad." That was all. "Okay, Dad." That was all. "Okay, Dad." Like I told him the wrong answer on a quiz. He called twice more over the next 4 months, both times with smaller numbers, both times with circumstances that sounded slightly different, but were fundamentally the same situation. His wife's car needed work. There was a gap in their insurance coverage for something I didn't fully understand. The second time, I said no again. I said it more easily than the first time. I don't know exactly when I stopped waiting to feel like his father. That sounds harsher than I mean it. I love my son. I have loved him since I saw him in the hospital 37 years ago, red-faced and furious at the world, and nothing he has done since then has changed that. But there is a difference between love and the kind of contortion I had been doing for years, reshaping myself to fit into whatever space he had left for me, pretending that was enough. In October, Loretta was diagnosed with early-stage breast cancer. It was caught on a routine mammogram, the kind of thing that, caught early, has very good odds. But Carrie called me when Loretta got the diagnosis and she was shaking. I could hear it in her voice. And I got in my car and drove over and we sat in the kitchen for 2 hours while Jean was at the oncologist appointment with Loretta. And I just stayed. I stayed because nobody asked me to leave. I stayed because staying was what family did. Loretta's treatment started in November. It was manageable. She was strong. But some days she was tired and Jean didn't want to leave her alone. And so I would come and sit with her while he ran errands. We watched old game shows. She was competitive at Jeopardy in a way that I found completely unreasonable and completely delightful. My son called in November. He did not ask how I was. He mentioned Thanksgiving. "I was thinking you could come this year," he said. "The kids have been asking about you." I felt something move in my chest at that. Not quite what I would have hoped to feel. I'm going to be with friends, I said. Silence. Friends, he repeated. Yes. What friends? He repeated. Yes. What friends? I told him about Loretta and Jean. Briefly, without drama, I said I'd met them a couple of years ago and that we'd become close. Dad, those aren't. You barely know these people. I know them pretty well by now. You should be with family. I didn't say anything for a moment. I chose my next words carefully, not out of anger, but because I meant them. I'll be with people who want me there. I said, I hope you have a good holiday. Thanksgiving at Loretta and Jean's was loud and imperfect and wonderful. Their son drove in from Kansas City with his wife and their infant daughter. Carrie brought a friend from work. I brought 2 pies and a very good bottle of bourbon. And at some point in the afternoon, Jean and I were in the backyard in the cold looking at a fence he was thinking about replacing, and we weren't even talking about much. And I thought, I'm not performing anything right now. That was the thing I hadn't realized I'd been doing. Performing. Performing the role of grateful, undemanding father. Performing the role of man who didn't need much. With Loretta and Jean and Carrie, I didn't perform anything. I was just a person who showed up, and that was enough. My son called again in February. This time it wasn't about money. He said he and his wife had been talking. He said he knew things had been off between us. He said he wanted to try to do better. He talked for a while about his wife's anxiety and the pressure of the mortgage and the kids' schedules, and I listened to all of it. At the end, I said, I appreciate you saying that. I mean it, Dad. I want us to be closer. I know. So, can we start over? I thought about the casserole dish I'd covered with foil on December 23rd, 2 years ago. I thought about the phrase, extra people. I thought about driving 4 hours to put together birthday bikes at 10 o'clock at night and then being told there wasn't room. We can move forward, I said. I like that. What does that mean? It means I love you and I'm your father, and that doesn't change. It means when you want to talk, I'm here. It means I hope you'll include me sometimes, and I hope I'll include you. But there's no but. That's just where I am. He was quiet. I don't think he'd expected that. I think he'd expected either the old version of me, the one who would have said, of course, anything, whenever you want, or the version of me who was angry enough to slam a door. I was neither. I was just a man who had, slowly and without planning to, built a life that didn't have a hole shaped like his approval in the center of it anymore. We have dinner twice a year now, usually. Once in the summer when I drive through Denver, once around the holidays if it works out. My grandchildren are growing up fast. The older one is 13 now, and he's got a dry sense of humor that I find genuinely funny. I bring them things they actually like. Small things. Practical things. I don't try too hard. Gene had a minor stroke in the spring. He's recovered almost completely. His speech came back within days and his strength came back within weeks, and the doctor said the prognosis was good. But those first 2 days, I drove to the hospital and I sat in the waiting room with Carrie, and I didn't leave until Loretta told me to go home and get some sleep. She said it in the exact tone my wife used to use when I was being stubborn about something. I noticed that. I didn't say anything about it, but I noticed. I am 66 years old. I live alone in a house in Omaha that is too big for one person, and I've never gotten around to doing anything about that. I have a pension and a retirement account and a financial advisor named Janet who will not let me make foolish decisions. I have a neighbor who brings me tomatoes from her garden in August because she always plants too many. I have a workshop key that Jean gave me so I can use it when he's busy, which is an act of trust I did not take lightly. I have Carrie who texts me articles and calls me when she needs to talk to someone who will actually listen. I have Loretta who beats me at Jeopardy every single time and doesn't even try to hide how much she enjoys it. I have my son in the way that I have him. I have my daughter who calls more than she used to since I stopped seeming like someone who needed managing. What I have learned is this, and it took me longer than it should have. You cannot make someone value you. You cannot perform your love loudly enough that a person who has decided you are useful will suddenly see you as irreplaceable. You cannot show up at enough birthday parties, drive enough miles, say yes enough times to fill the space that would only ever be filled by someone actually wanting you there. But you can walk into a diner on Christmas Eve and sit down next to a stranger in a world's okayest grandma pin. You can say yes when she says come to dinner, we have too much food. You can show up at 4 o'clock with a casserole you've been keeping in your refrigerator for 4 days and a bottle of decent wine, And you can sit at a table with people who have no reason to want you there except that they simply do. You can let yourself be chosen. That's the thing nobody tells you when you're spending years making yourself smaller, so someone else is more comfortable. Nobody tells you that you are also allowed to choose, that the family you were born into is not the only family you get. That chosen family doesn't feel like a consolation prize once you're actually inside it, sitting at a kitchen table playing cards while someone's grandkid shows you something on a phone you barely understand. And you realize your face hurts from laughing and you haven't thought about what you're supposed to be for hours. I went to Loretta's last chemotherapy appointment with her. Jean drove. I sat in the back with her, and she read her paperback and I read mine. And we didn't talk much because we didn't need to. In the waiting room, Jean got us terrible coffee from the machine, and Loretta said, "Jean, this is undrinkable," and drank the whole thing anyway. And I thought about how much I liked these people. How straightforwardly, uncomplicatedly much I liked them. On the way home, we stopped for lunch. Loretta ordered a Reuben and said it was the best thing she'd eaten in 6 weeks. Jean stole half her fries. I watched the two of them bicker about the fries with the ease of 43 years together, and I felt something I can only describe as gratitude, though it's wider than that word usually covers. I was not their family, but I was there, and they wanted me there. And some days, that is the whole thing. My son doesn't know about most of this. He knows I have friends in Omaha. He doesn't know what they mean to me or what the last 2 years have looked like from the inside. He doesn't need to. He is my son. I love him the way you love someone who is woven into you, into the fabric of how you became yourself. That doesn't go away. But I stopped building my weeks around whether he called, stopped measuring my worth by whether he needed me, stopped keeping myself in a state of readiness for a closeness that was never quite going to arrive. I stopped waiting. And in the space where the waiting had been, something else came in. I didn't go looking for it. It sat down 2 stools over at a diner counter and asked me if the eggs were worth it. They weren't, but I kept ordering them anyway. And that, it turned out, was not a bad way to find your way back to something. I've had a lot of time to think about how I got here. Not in a bitter way, more like the way you retrace a hiking trail after you already made it back safely, just to understand which turns actually mattered. What I kept coming back to was this: the way my son treated me didn't happen overnight, and the way I let it happen didn't either. For years I told myself that staying quiet was the kind thing to do, that swallowing my own needs was just what good fathers did. I thought patience was the same thing as wisdom. It isn't. Patience without honest self-examination is just a slow way of disappearing. Every time I said yes when I should have said I need more than this, I made it a little easier for everyone around me to expect that I always would. That's not blame. That's just cause and effect, as plain as anything. The choices we make and the ones we don't make teach the people in our lives exactly what we'll accept. My son learned from me in part. He learned that I would show up regardless. He learned that my presence could be taken for granted. I taught him that without meaning to, and I had to sit with that before I could move forward honestly. What changed me wasn't anger. It was Loretta asking a simple question in a diner. What are you going to do instead? She didn't fix me. She just refused to let me sit in the problem without looking at it directly. That's what genuine connection does. It doesn't flatter you or manage you. It treats you like someone capable of figuring things out. That's what I'd been missing. Not someone to feel sorry for me, but someone who expected me to still be a full person. The courage it took to say no to my son, twice, then a third time, wasn't dramatic. It didn't feel righteous in the moment. It felt uncomfortable and a little lonely. But here is what I know about that discomfort now. It was the first honest thing I'd done in years. Not cruel, not cold, just honest. There is a kind of quiet integrity in holding your own boundaries without announcing them, without making the other person the villain in a story you tell yourself. I didn't cut my son off. I just stopped handing him the center of my life to do whatever he wanted with. Resilience, I've learned, isn't about recovering fast. It's about what you choose to build during the time you thought you were just waiting. I didn't plan to find Loretta and Jean in Cary. I drove to a diner because I couldn't face cereal alone on Christmas Eve. That's it. But I said yes to the casserole dish and the bottle of wine and the card game at the kitchen table. And I kept saying yes. And slowly something real took shape around me. My son is not a bad person. He is someone who made choices that revealed what he valued. And I am someone who finally got honest enough with myself to respond to what was actually true instead of what I wished were true. That's the whole story. The rest. Jean's workshop key, Loretta's jeopardy. face carries texts at odd hours. That's just what life looks like when you stop shrinking yourself to fit a space that was never going to be big enough anyway.